It is quite striking that I spend most of my teaching life bringing aesthetics, meaning incarnation, to an absence. In fact, apparently not when we work on music written centuries before us, which is transmitted most of the time solely by the notation, which leaves a lot of room for interpretation, which then could be considered by purists regarding how you play, think, and display or perform it as a betrayal, let less on which instrument. So the authenticity compared to the universality of the message that is vehicled through these pieces which we teach. But there is a fundamental absence that as a teacher I'm trying to, if not complete, aesthetically to fill up meaningfully through analysis, but also through conviction. After all, it's part of it, and it is so incredible that we work daily with classical music, as the non-classical musicians call it, centuries of different styles of written manuscripts that through editions came to us today, of course revisited by their editors. And then, since the invention of the sound and video recording, we have on top of that a layer of interpretations from past and recent times, which sort of sandwich on top of the text itself. So it's like, what is it exactly that we are supposed to go from in order to reach the root of the DNA of the composer's thought process, and then emotional construction and projection of a mood, feeling, or assessment of a point of view? Is it an ideology? Is it a form? Is it an expression of a spirituality, as well as perhaps sometimes the expression of human interaction through dance and singing, while also used in the uplifting of the spirit when used in church music? Okay, the music had a function which doesn't have today when it's played centuries after. It's played for its aesthetic beauty. But there is this fundamental absence of the creator. And I feel like I spend most of my teaching time filling that gap, hyphenating between the student eager to know, to understand, to be informed, to be given a frame of what is supposed, allowed, or not, and then at the same time forge their own opinion besides my conviction. And that's going to happen in time. It doesn't happen during the teaching time. It happens like harvesting a garden and hoping for this blooming moment when I might not be here to see it, but I would have perhaps helped enlarge the horizon, forge the clef of knowledge. Like I use it purposely as a music clef, but it's fact the analogy with the key and the lock, in order to find by themselves, through forging their own key, what it means to them, in order to teach it in turn. Not just reciting what was the orthodoxy of this edition compared to now more we don't accept this other edition, which used to be worshipped in these years and now it's the new truth is this and the old truth is that, and the interpretations of such and such are no more valuable because fashion has changed. So you would think, so what does, in absolute terms, the music that we are teaching, translating from the notation, have to do with fashion and humans? Well, it has to do with the fact of the now and the present now, the fierce necessity of considering the music we teach and play in the presence of making it. Does it mean we have philosophically to ignore the fact that it's a remote imagination notated on remote, even sometimes obsolete notation today through the clefs, again, in music, the different clefs that are no more used? And then beyond the technicality of the notation and the lack of improvisation or notation for the improvisatory expectations that has to be rediscovered, redefined, and not always agreed, because since again is the absence, they were read in between the lines by the performers of the time when it was composed, because it was part of the ecosystem. So they knew what they were doing because they knew what they were reading, and they knew what was supposed to be embellished and how, without to have to notate it. And then, of course, some were perhaps more creative than others, and I'm sure people didn't agree even then. But the fact that we try, now that we study music with more knowledge than they ever had for their own past, we can do the chronology and the styles and the aesthetics of each time period, country, geographically, and individualities of composers who were Italianate or German or French, or had a little bit of this influence in the Flemish and the Dutch and the this and the that. So you can go into subdivisions of micro details which make you become passionate by some extremely non-universal aspect of music, which would be the niche. And the universality of music doesn't implement to be less knowledgeable about the detail. The originality aesthetically that differentiates the music from southern Spain, from northern Spain, from southern Italy to northern Italy, from Prussia to Russia, etc. In other words, you have this capacity to become a choreographer. I was going to say that's when you teach how to play directly, but archaeologist rather, and defining what is that is right, or compared to what would be wrong, to perform these pieces, regardless of the gap of time, of the gap of instruments, or the gap of hearing. The very rapport that we have today compared to the peoples of the time when it was composed, to dissonances and consonances, to tensions and releases, the rapport to lengths compared to shortnesses, redundancies, repetitivity compared to today, where we tend to think that we don't need to restate after all, because in a way we have too much music going on. And in the past, when there was very little music going on other than the one they could play and produce, and not the reproduced music that today is available constantly everywhere and all the time, and then polluting in a way but in the background, our intention to complete the understanding of the purpose and meaning of this music with its own context. And so out of the context, you hear the music in the supermarket, but you don't even hear it because it's in the background. And it's not meant to be as a background music if it was meant to be a reflective music. Or there is no pop music in the past, so it was by essence people's music when they were using it for their social encounters. Would be the dance, could be the singing combined. And then of course you had the worship music, which was there to elevate the spirit through a universal language that is music, bringing the universality of the religion, that literally means connecting people. And so there was a different way of understanding the meaning of music, which is not just an entertainment as it's today, or on the other side, something for the happy few that is an elitist place where they only listen to it and study it and write articles about it or record it among themselves. In other words, the commoner in the street, you ask them what's the difference in the interpretation of a piece by Schubert between Clara Haskell and Lang Lang, they would say, I don't know. And if you tell them something about a pop song sang by another pop singer than the one that created the song, they would be very specific. And they're like, oh, come on, don't confuse that. Which is understandable, because when you love, you understand. When you understand because of your curiosity, you're feeling your curiosity antennas so that you can focus towards what is more in between the lines, between the words, between the notes that I'm supposed to know. And then you go see a guru 1, guru 2, guru 3, who will either convince you, either not, either perhaps alternatively and be convinced by the one that worshipping with images like in 8th century was rejected in Christianity and then was readopted and then was re-rejected, iconoclastic and iconophiles. So there are different ways of worshipping that went through a lot of cataclysms, ended up in wars, and the representation of the sacred was the core of that. And the representation of music by itself as a language that doesn't mean other than what it says itself, like a language vehicles through the phonemes that we produce vowels and consonants with our mouth and our vocal cords when we don't sing, and even if we do, is supposed to be a transmission of meanings, concepts. And then we have to have this conceptual brain and this capacity of thinking things without to be able to constantly put images on them. And so, of course, you could say that we don't react emotionally to a dissonance or a consonance of a given composer compared to its time period and today. And for that, we have to always be cautious, because none of us were in most of the times when it was played. But since we have that document, regardless how precise or lack of precision is in the text, which leaves room for interpretation, which embedded improvisation and at least embellishment, and sometimes the good and bad taste of this added value by the performer, in a way, was part of the music making. And since the music was made in their own time, for their own time, and then didn't get recorded or published for so long that it transmitted itself, for the pop music, or the folk rather music, transmitted by oral tradition in every civilization of the world, with pulse, rhythm, singing, and some aspect of language that evolved from or disappeared because of the dialect and the historic events of invasions, colonizations. But the music, in terms of pitches, and the pulse in terms of the rhythm, sort of remains. And even if the styles evolve with the time periods, the evocation of human excitement, anxiety, happiness, sadness, hope, rejoicing, or struggle and then connected to the worshiping, connected to the in a way ideology that through aesthetic art, as we call today, soft power for the ideology besides economy and armament. It's what we visit when we visit museums today. We visit museums where we're told during the 7-Year War, this painter did this composer did that, and during the 100 Years War, then this and that art forms evolved from this and that according to this religious wars, such and thus. And so you go, okay, in England, the Catholic composers, the Protestant composers, and if you only filter the knowledge of the composers and therefore the meaning you'll put in their creation when you play it outside of their time period today, should not be reductive or reduced rather to only their social and practical aspect, in the sense of music being the vehicle for uplifting of the spirits through worship, or escapism through dancing, or social or political statements, as the King Louis XIV did with the dance, and Lully creating the opera ballet as a combined art form, the opera work in Italy, or in Italian rather, but also in Italy, of course. And so you have a mass, you have an opera, you have ballet, you have basically pantomime if it's only danced and with music. Then you add also singers, and then you express through a set, a statement of times before, like a lot of the 18th century operas were retelling the universality of humans' story, love, hate, hope, betrayal, power, greed, of the antiquity. And so you have all these various forms of Romeo and Juliet, archetypical, impossible love ending in death and then in an eternity. And so they were casually avoiding to decrypt in opera their own music through their music, meaning their own time period situations, because of the fact of absolute monarchies or church systems, so that there was a censorship and the fear and dissent. So a marriage of Figaro by Mozart, or abdiction of the Seraglio, or the Magic Flute are, besides to be masterpieces of music as we know it to be, there were also manifestos and statements of a social, of intellectual, and of course of Age of Enlightenment, Masonic point of view of brotherhood of humanity versus the oppression of the church the way it used to be, and the fear of the church that was organizing the crowds from disobeying. A lot of things come in mind when you think about a piece of music that we play today from the past. We can also decide, okay, today's today, yesterday was yesterday, and we just take what we need from the piece, which is its perhaps universal message, and we don't deal with the want to or need to revisit its roots, its own inspiration, its own predecessors in terms of what inspired them, and play it today as if it's music written today. And that is the fact that the music of the time was mostly the music of their own day, and the music of classical music, as we say today, as I said, rather defined by those who are not in the classical music. But after all, I use their definition, is to be in fact reflecting upon the fact that we're not then, and today we are in our own reality, but in a way we are in an escapism of their reality. So either because we ignore that gap or that confrontation of realities by just extracting the music outside of its context, of its intent of the time, of its tension release harmonically or melodically or contrapuntically. In other words, this incarnated from its own time period, like as if we take it as an archaeologist, an artifact presented in a museum, then we make a copy of it and we start using it today. And so that's basically what we do. And when the student comes and asks, am I supposed to play that fast? Am I supposed to put the pedal in this genre, this style, in this time period music specifically? Am I supposed to play the grace notes on the beats? Am I supposed to play the pedal harmonically or melodically? Am I supposed to do rubato to express the meaning or the emotion that I sense in it? Or am I not allowed in this time period's aesthetic? And so, of course, you're the sort of weather maker station that they come to see about the forecast if I'm going to be harvesting or not. And they say, so am I supposed to do this in Bach on the piano? Am I not? I'm supposed to play legato, non-legato, even, uneven, expressing the accelerando, diminuendo, rettenuto, all these different variants of the expression through which I define what is an emotional abstract on top of a note that is evident there because it's a tonic or a dominant, but then you have all the other ones, the altered degrees, the dissonant degrees that combine with other degrees of dissonance rather. So you could say all these by themselves vehicle an emotional or psychological response in the listener, just like a film goer who is going to be told a story basically, and the music that is written is supposed to enhance or prepare to live more intensely the emotion, the drama, the joy, the fear, or the anxiety of the situation of the characters. And in a way, you can watch it without music, or you can focus on the music of the film. But the music of the film is the literally soundtrack of the storytelling of the film. And playing music in real life could be considered the soundtrack of our lives. And if that corresponds to a time period that we're not living in, then we need this translation. So we have editions, recordings, and of course living teachers. And this is where I feel being the hyphen, that because I feel like at some point I'm filling up an absence. Like, hello, Friscobaldi, how are you? What are we doing with this piece section, this bar, that? What did you have in mind? We can't. And if we could, should we? After all, if they left written, well, of course, they must improvised. But let's say the little percentage that was left written that comes to us unadulterated, except by the fact that we can't decipher it by ourselves unless we have a specialist help us understand how to read intelligently the page and what is decorative, from what is ornamental, from what is thematic, from what is organic, from what is harmonic, from what is tonal, or what is, I mean, there are so many aspects to the analysis of the narrative storytelling besides the intuition. God, I love it. I don't need anybody to explain to me why this is so beautiful or moving and why this is so joyful. Okay, then we stay at the level of the emotion that is triggered by the psychological signs that come up and tell us that this is anguished. And this is with the leap perhaps of the interval, or with the tempo that we choose to do for the lips, something more playful because it's evocative of dance. it's evident that if Bach had written this subject, it's less fun than, or, but what is a leap of a sixth in today's music, where we have so much more range, and most of the music exponentially expands more in its range than the 18th century Bach writing, but we still find it amazing, explosive, driven, jubilating, incredibly moving. And so if I say, no, it's not supposed to be like that, it's supposed to be legato and singing, because we have a piano that has long resonance before the decay, or somebody saying, not at all, we have to imitate the harpsichord with a short decay. And then you go to the paradox of the fact that the tuning has changed too. So, but the ears also, we don't have Baroque ears, but then when we study with the tuning of the past, we can say that it might have sounded in terms of pitch. And even not so, because of the different ways of tuning. But then all of a sudden we consider, for those who have perfect pitch, that C sharp major for this subject is the only right key, because it is, since it is on the score, but also because we associate it with the piece. In other words, we already pre-programmed to like it in that key, and we hear it in another key, even if the intervals are the same for the relative pitch, which is right. All of a sudden, like Scriabin, who was associating colors to tonalities, synesthesia, and so many others also consider that the choice of a tonality, it's really the sound painting background or soundscape of the painter of music. Then we can say this cannot be in another tonality, but it was. So of course the people who heard it then, it is a very difficult thing for me, because I think about these things, I self-interrupt my thought to say that, first of all, because many thoughts come in mind, and at the end of it, I'm sure it's sounding confusing because it's not a written conference. It's a passionate, driven, but spontaneous flow of thoughts towards defining how to bring alive the absence of what we teach, with a rare exception of contemporary music, and the majority of the time we teach music of long-time dead composers, for times that are no more now, either aesthetically, either religiously, either emotionally, either language-wise. And so, yes, the music is universal, and so we come from Asia, from Africa, from Europe, from anywhere, in order to go and understand, develop what we are feeling attracted to through a knowledge and a skill. The skill how to play, and the knowledge what it means. But we don't really think we need to be told what it means, because paradoxically, in the first place, we bypassed that. As I said, the language is transmission of thought processes and of explaining through words concepts. So therefore there is a purpose to the language, other than the aesthetic beauty of the language, which escapes those who don't speak the language. So it becomes lost in translation, where you could like the language for the sounds it makes, but when you realize what the meanings of those sounds are, you are literally lost in translation, because you would have assumed aesthetically that, I don't know, a long vowel would be something very tender, but it could be that in that given language it's an insult word. And it doesn't matter, because if you don't use the language to vehicle a concept, then you use it only aesthetically to vehicle what? Expression through length of sound or shortness of sound, high pitch or low pitch, combined, layered or vertical, chordal or voiced, monodic or polyphonic. And I find that when the student asks, am I supposed to or not, at some point after running out of explanation, argumentations, and it takes a lot of time to do that, since you spend, like I did, many years studying about these things, and I could just recite the articles and the books and the treatises and the wisdom of the people coming before us in arts aesthetic, explaining, defending a certain point of view about the representation of spirituality or not, and representation of musical purpose in this piece, and what was the purpose of it, and should it be only because of the purpose or just by itself because of the pretty sounds that it makes. And pretty is not pejorative, I would say. Even the thought-provoking, not comfortable to be around sounds too. So when I get to that point, of course I could answer to the students' questions, which need in the first place a shaping of their thinking about, am I supposed to play rubato in Bach? Am I supposed to ritenuto at the end of each movement or piece? Am I supposed to express music with these decorations on the beats or before the beats? Am I supposed to put pedal or not? Okay, so you could answer yes, no, because you know that there are the basic rules that we all learn about stylistic facts, more or less applied, more or less full of exceptions, which would confirm the rule, and there are so many. But let's say that you go through all this process of learning the rules and what things have to be avoided in order to create another creativity, like in part writing, avoiding parallelism in order to think creatively, contrapunto, therefore, opposite directions, and that creates then a sense of aesthetic that has the music in moving parts rather than in drones holding on a single note and then repeating until the next. So between Gregorian chant and Chopin, it seems like two unattainably distant worlds, but it's only a few short centuries of a lot of evolution, of a lot of short lives, in terms of a lot of evolution of the musical place in society, and therefore its aesthetic, dictated or not by this rule or that rule of aesthetics, of church, of, whatever it was, it evolved. And it went beyond the devil of music, which was for the Gregorians triton. Frankly, if you play a Liszt sonata, you see diminished seventh almost every bar. So does it make it a devilish sonata? Yes, for the Gregorians who are not alive to know it. But when we can and do study those different styles in survey of history of music, or styles which we discover or compare or rediscover or understand better, because it takes lots of time, lots of layers of relearning in order to organize the chronology of events to understand them, so that at some point you can yourself become the teacher and not just, as I said earlier, the recitant of some truth. So the answer to the question of the students when they need it, I tell them, do this, think that. I say because, and then I give an example, and sometimes I give an example of what the composer avoided, like this, compared to, and all of a sudden you appreciate more the leaps when you see that it could have been the same harmonic progression without them. And I think that this system of teaching, by giving a little by little sense of thinking outside of the box, helps the student create in time, with their own accumulation of knowledge and experience, but not only, but both, for sure, their own conviction. And how will they answer in turn to their own students, asking, how am I supposed to think, play, hear this, in which tempo, phrasing? I heard such and such on the recording, but I didn't like this. So if it goes down to I like, I don't like, or I find it more exciting, less exciting, it's true that that is what triggers us very obviously to do life choices with test buds and people's characters, and I like to be with such and I don't like being with such. But there is to art forms so many more layers. You rather say, as my teacher told me already when I was a child, don't say I don't like or I like, say I don't understand, and I'll try again. And that doesn't mean to have no opinion. That means not to be undriven by some passion that by essence makes an exclusion in order to love. Like I was going to say first, then switch to love, but I think both. And so, yes, you exclude something in order to worship something. And like people say, I love you you're the most beautiful person in the world, but you didn't do a survey. And you don't need to. It's a way to do the to give value to the rarity, and the rarity being the value, then you say this is the choice. And I think that if I give them as students some tools to decode by themselves the expression of a given gesture for the rhetoric of the time period, and see how they will adapt it on the modern instrument of today, if they don't play the music on the instrument of the time, which is a different approach. But whichever approach, there is a universality in the music, no matter what. Perhaps the instrument of the piano today is more universal because, in a way, it's not. It should be, but it's not limited to a given repertoire, which is only what's written for the last, let's say, 100 years. But in fact, you can play Bach on the piano, even if harpsichordists would consider it wrong. But you can't play a Rachmaninoff concerto on a harpsichord, because in a way the instrument dictates you the style, the niche, the country, the specific time period, by the tuning, by the way it's constructed, or the copies built upon a model that was done for this repertoire. So you have an instrument for a repertoire with a tuning that is always very circumscribed in the time period, and you become a specialist of a niche. And on the piano, you're not a specialist of a niche, you're like a general practitioner. You play a recital, and you play a Bach, a Chopin, a Rachmaninoff, a Hindemith, I don't know, a Prokofiev or a Bartok piece. Within an hour, you've just played so many different styles on the same instrument. So what you make a difference is the forte in Beethoven compared to Prokofiev, or the staccato in Mozart compared to the staccato in Bartok. One drier, one lighter, one the opposite, depends on the context of the piece. Not only the time period, but also, since we want to bring a sense of knowledge through our aesthetic shaping of the sound, besides our own ability to play. And you hear a Glenn Gould play on a recording when you drive, on the radio, or on a recording, and you know after 2 notes it's his phrasing, his touch. It's his signature. Or Rubinstein, or Horowitz, or Lipati, or so on. And of course, ultimately, I find that very exciting to answer as a philosopher with a question to the question of the student. Am I supposed to? I could say, oh, what do you think? But in order to think, they have to have established analytical roots in order to know, in fact, to make some exclusions. and say, okay, it's not romantic era, it's not classic era, perhaps it's galant era, and then I know these symphonies, these ballets, these operas of that time, these masses of that time, and then I am aware of other pieces by composers of the same time period, and then I sort of immerse myself in a given geographic timeline, and then I play it on my universal instrument, but I hear it differently than when I play music of the early 50s of the 20th century versus the 50s of the 19th century. Of course, you can just blindly follow the notation, and if the publisher's editor has been more prolific to write to you more micromanaging of the unwritten details, or the teacher defines them for you very directly and doesn't give you any room of freedom as a student by saying, for the time being is asymmetrical. I know, you don't. I have experience, you don't. I have studied, you are studying. Therefore, it's like filling up an empty bottle from a full bottle, and then shake up and then fill up the next one, in turn, meaning. It's not so simple, obviously. It's way more subtle than that, of course. But what I wanted to emphasize today is that my realization is that despite of our faith in music, or which music, and our feeling of closeness to a given time period more than another, aesthetically, emotionally, intellectually, religiously, spiritually, oh God, I like Scriabin and Chopin, and others would say, oh no, my favorite is Ligeti, or perhaps not at all, I prefer Scarlatti in his sonatas. So we immerse ourselves in a escapism again, but that's not a negative word per se, as if it appears to be, pejorative at least. It's like we immerse ourselves in a time period, and then we define the tools of expression of that time period according to what we read, what we heard, and what we learned. And we trusted the teacher. And then we can reject the teaching and reject what we learned and rethink of it on our own and say, in fact, I disagree the way I was taught. I like it rather this and that. And then if you don't have to explain why you like it like that, that's fine. You're just a performer, which is marvelous. Nobody asked Mrs. Argerich why and how she plays what she plays. You don't ask a musicologist or a music scholar to be a concert pianist and a concert pianist to be a scholar. You could be both for some, but it's rare. And even so, people prefer in today's highly specialized society to have professional, knowledgeable people for each niche, each compartment of the knowledge of a given know-how. And that's to say the least. So my purpose as a teacher ends up by being, which I realize more clearly now than ever, is to fill, F-I-L-L, the absence of the composer by becoming either the surrogate, either the hyphen, either the lawyer on behalf of the estate of the composer's aesthetic entity, not being the guardian of the temple, but in some students who are very driven, they have passions for this or that performer, regardless if they teach. And then they would rather already make even the point of their own aesthetic world as listeners, of course, driven by their passion for playing, by adapting or adopting a preferred performer for a given genre. I prefer Chopin by Rubinstein and, I don't know, Rachmaninoff by Horowitz. Then beyond that, what it means is that we constantly try to incarnate what is disincarnated through the score, which is our only medium with the past of the composer in the absence of the composer, the absence of the maker, the author. So do I wrongly suggest what is the purpose, the expression, and the climax of a phrase of a given composer, just because it corresponds to my liking, or to my education, or to my experience? And the student trusts me, then will trust another teacher, and then at some point might have to say, I have to now make the synthesis of so many things, meaning so many different things to so many musicians. In this diversity, you can be lost. At the same time, the sophistication is not per essence a complication. It's a subtlety that adds on the path of knowledge for what you love by becoming cultivated. And then defining a musical sound frame for a given composer on the same instrument than another composer in a recital on the same instrument. I don't believe that you can sound different drastically, like as if you play the oboe piano or the clarinet piano. There's not a timbre change like in orchestral instruments or chamber music. But you have more about shadows and lights and length and short of the length and the decay and the pedal or not. So you play with aesthetic tools which are more evocative than explaining. You evoke the oboe, you evoke a dancer, you evoke a soprano opera singer, but you don't really do it. You just imitate. And then when you play a fugue or a sonata, which is conceptual and formal, even if it's also related to other, could be choir or instrumental music of other instruments genre, it is mostly instrumental music, doesn't need the text, and just needs the written text of the notes, the sounds. And the fact that a written page can mean so many different things to so many different people with their own convictions and rejections puzzles the student. Does it really? Because in the first place, the student comes to you because the student comes to experience, understand, and perhaps challenge what you would tell them about what they love in the piece. And in this exchange, rather than just, as I said earlier, the asymmetrical pouring of a knowledge on an all-accepting student, is the opposite that happens. The teacher learns from the student's rediscovery of the piece that the teacher discovered a few decades earlier. And this piece relives anew. And no matter how open-minded and creative and wide horizon, open horizon, the tolerance for different interpretations of the teacher is, the student could surprise the teacher by a convincing different way. Now, who defines as convincing when it's different and not rejecting for not being orthodox knowledge of what is supposed to be? The other ones don't know how it's supposed to be. Comes down to my teacher, Mademoiselle Boulanger, who taught me to be tolerant with the others and ruthless with myself. Well, that's difficult because then that would assume that you have to accept anything and be very intensely critical with yourself for anything. It's easier the other way around. Anything goes for me and the others don't know what they're doing. Which is basically a shortcut to a lot of people's way of thinking. And in a way, social survival in professional situations or even human, or both. But regardless, the point is that there is that absence. And so if I say Beethoven wanted this to be more dotted than the notation because it's more dramatic. Or if I say he notated it with 30 seconds, not 64s, therefore it's not supposed to be like the beginning of the Appassionata. It's not a grace note, it's a 16th note. And if you hold the note and you think 16th note, then it's less mysterious than. So do we have that license as performers to enhance the length or the shortness because we want to obtain through this rhythmic enhancement or distortion more of an effect? It's mysterious, but even more because I played for you. Or do we stay subjectively away from the score and say objectively, these are the notes, I play them, and once I do it all right, it has to sound well because I don't compose it, it was composed by somebody else. I am the craftsman, not the artist who rethinks it or recreates it. Or the other way is to say, I am the artist, I am given the license to retell the story on behalf of the dead composer, who anyway, in absence here, I am present on the stage, I'm incarnating the Liszt Sonata my way. Regardless if it's the tradition of my teacher or my own after I rejected it, blah, blah, blah. And of course you have a bunch of people who don't know the piece who will find it striking or unnerving, because they wouldn't have criterias anyway. And then you have those who have heard it or who have performed it or who are studying it, who will start rejecting you immediately by saying, oh, he doesn't or she doesn't play it like such and such, I like it more with such and such. And so on and so forth. So we associate the music, the purpose, the intent, the composer in absence, the text in presence, and we make it say what we want it to say, in fact. Oh, I think it's supposed to be faster. I think it's supposed to be in cut time. Well, it's not really, but it's written in 4/4 but says andante, or it's written in 2/2 with a cut time but it says adagio. So we try to justify our choices when we teach by verbalizing the facts of the notation and make them. We push the argument in the direction of our aesthetic, in fact, influenced or our own aesthetic attraction. And so, of course, when you conduct an orchestra, you have to come with an opinion and bring the musicians to your opinion, regardless if they disagree with you or not. By contract, they're supposed to do what you tell them during the rehearsal. Now, that's a contract. But you could also do it by your charisma and your conductor's experience or your conductor's, you're so convincing because you're so convinced and you're so immersed, and you cannot be doubting between beats, because then the whole structure of the group will dislocate. So in part, the conductor doesn't play an instrument, but is in charge of all these in-between notes of the instruments. Before the sound comes in the exhalation, they have to take the time to intake the breath, so the conductor has to take this in account when giving a cue to start after they count their rests compared to others. And so the music goes from different instruments to others, but in the piano, it goes from the pianist to the pianist. We are our own conductor and orchestra. So I like to think that my teaching brings to the students rigor and excitement in the intuitive validation of their love for the piece. Even if I put criteria to dislike or criticize or say it's wrong to think of it this way because of that time period according to what I know, learned, and feel. Now, if they want, they can please me during the lesson and anyway do anything else the rest of their life as an artist, contradicting or acquiescing. I'm not asking for yes people, yes men, as they say. But it's harder when they argue, but it's also challenging. And I think that we're already challenged by ourselves, because after all, we're not the same as decades ago when we play the piece we learned. It reveals itself differently. It's an incredible gift that keeps on giving, but also on puzzling and saying, oh God, I used to play it so fast. Why? I rather play this, the legato and the singing and the quality. And perhaps I messed up when I was young because I was so influenced by such and such that I missed some things that I would like to explore now. And you have performers like Glenn Gould, who recorded twice the Well-Tempered or the Goldberg variations within I don't know how many decades, but many, because he died very young at 50 on our standards. It's not just for the sake of it, it's just because we evolve ourselves. Imagine that less a student. So a student comes, meets a teacher, and then has an opinion, and then has a rejection or an acceptance, and then develops their own. But in order to develop their own, I like to give them the food for thought that will create their own interpretation in the line of mine, in the case they study with me, or taking away or taking off from that trajectory on their own, regardless if it's contradictory with mine. If not, it would be cloning. They come to me so they can play like me. But I don't understand that. I mean, I do. It's very pleasing. I have to say another more strict word, I would say flattering. And I don't know how strict flattering is. Probably provocative. We can be lost in translation in the language when we talk to each other in another language than our mother tongue. Then we have the capacity to believe that this is the specific genre of the given time period of music way to play it today. And I think you have to have these alternative convictions through time. Be flexible intellectually and humble enough to question the status quo that you would have either created, inherited, or helped develop, or as well as be comforted in your opinion and say, oh, this is how it's supposed to be. And even when we have recordings of performers, composers like Rachmaninoff today available compared to, let's say, Beethoven or Scarlatti, people don't agree with the performer-composer, the producer-consumer direct line. And when you go to the retailer, then it's the teacher. It's in between. And then you have the explanation of the added value to it. You love it, but let me explain to you why you should love it. And you can say as a student, but I don't love it that way. It doesn't mean to me that. I find it too slow. I like it faster. And in a way, pianism is also the jubilation of the tips of the fingers. It's fun to play. That's the very purpose why we call it playing. Of course, in practicing a difficult piece, we can call it suffering. Or will I ever be able to play it like I love it? Or like some incredible pianist in my pantheon of pianists does it? But all that is the fact that we worship an absence. And the absence becomes so alive because when we play the music of the distant past, it's in our present, and we don't think of it as the past. And because I age enough to be with a little distance, with the necessity to always explain, justify every suggestion of interpretation I would give, I go to the shortcut which makes the student smile or in disbelief, thinking that I am already senile, by saying the composer told me. So when it's Brahms and Beethoven, they realize that either I'm pulling their leg, either I'm genuinely mentally ill. And I guess working with the absence of the composer for so many years, in my case, since I know myself, um, reaches a point where you know how much you don't know. You assume, you shape, you organize, you give a temporary answer to the unknown during a performance where you feel like you're constructing this ephemeral sandcastle on the beach, and then it's convincing as far as the moment, as soon as it's finished, is ephemerally gone. And if it's recorded, then it sort of perpetuates that ephemeral moment, which in phenomenology would be a ludicrous thing to do, because after all, once it's said, it's gone. So it has to be restated. So the present matters of the moment more than the frozen present that can be restated. And in a way, you end up by worshipping an interpretation, perhaps, compared to the piece itself. And say, I don't like this sonata, I like it played by such and such. And then it becomes such and such sonata. Is almost like as if the performer becomes the composer in the absence of that one. A lot of food for thought. Incarnating the absence of a composer's thought through imperfect notation, which leads to beautiful, multiple paths of interpretation, choosingly, and remaining, if possible, in this choosy way, extremely tolerant for the difference. Because who knows? It takes one ingredient combined to another in a different way. It's very subtle. And all of a sudden a phrase smells like a different flower than the flower you thought it smelled. With my endless analogies that come always on the spot, I get to always add more to the more. I should have more abstract thinking, but I always think in analogies. Sometimes he helps. Keeps things very fresh. In any case, even if you've known the piece for a long time and the student for a very short time, you feel both like astronauts through this unknown universe where it's so enchanted, tempting, moving, meaningful. Oh, you want to be there. I want to be on the moon. Analogy for daydreaming. Thank you.